The shot glass was an inch from the biker's mouth when the 22-year-old waitress, shaking so violently the empty bottles on her tray rattled, choked out three words. "Don't drink that." In an instant, the jukebox abruptly died. The heavy deadbolts on the front doors clicked shut, and sitting 3 stools away, a cartel hitman suddenly realized he wasn't the predator anymore. He was the prey. Deep in the sweltering expanse of San Bernardino County, where the Mojave Desert threatens to swallow the cracked asphalt of Route 66, stood the Rusty Spur. It wasn't a tourist trap. It was a concrete bunker with neon beer signs, a gravel parking lot perpetually stained with motor oil, and a reputation that kept the local police cruisers rolling right on past without tapping their brakes. For Sadie Jennings, it was just a desperately needed paycheck. She was 3 weeks into the job, a college dropout drowning in her late father's medical debts, working the grueling graveyard shifts because the tips were thicker when the patrons were drunker. She had learned the brutal ecosystem of the Rusty Spur quickly. The regulars were rough. The truckers were exhausted and prone to anger. And the owner, a grizzled old-timer named Hank, didn't tolerate mistakes. But rule number 1 at the Spur had absolutely nothing to do with watering down the well drinks or closing out bar tabs. Rule number 1 was simple. When the Hells Angels rode in, the world stopped. It was a Tuesday night, just past 11, when the familiar, rib-rattling thunder of V-twin engines vibrated through the bar's floorboards. Sadie paused, her wiping rag hovering over a sticky tabletop as the front door swung open. The desert wind blew in a cloud of fine dust, closely followed by 5 men wearing the infamous Winged Death's head on their leather cuts. Leading the pack was Arthur "Artie" Shaw, the sergeant-at-arms for the local charter. Artie was a mountain of a man with a silver-streaked beard, scarred knuckles, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing in his periphery. Behind him walked Bobby the Wrench Callahan, Theodore "Theo Gun" Morrison, and 2 other patched members who moved with the casual, terrifying confidence of apex predators. They didn't ask for a table. They simply walked to the oversized corner booth in the back, and the civilian patrons sitting there instantly grabbed their beers and scattered without a word of protest. "Sadie," Hank barked from behind the mahogany bar, his voice a low, urgent gravel. "Get the reserve bottle. You know the drill." Sadie nodded, her heart doing its usual nervous flutter. She retrieved the special bottle of single-barrel bourbon Hank kept locked away specifically for Artie's crew. No menus, no questions. Just glass, ice, and premium brown liquor. As she prepared the tray, the atmosphere in the bar shifted imperceptibly. It wasn't just the heavy, dominating presence of the Angels. The front door had opened again, slipping a solitary figure into the smoky room. He was entirely out of place. He wore a dark, tailored denim jacket, immaculate leather boots that had never seen a hard day's work, and a calm, dead-eyed expression. His name was Damian Russo. He didn't look like a cartel sicario, and that was exactly what made him so incredibly lethal. The Sonora Cartel had learned the hard way that sending heavily tattooed, flashy enforcers into Southern California dive bars drew far too much heat. Damian was a ghost, a clean-cut, highly paid contractor brought in to solve specific, high-level problems. And Artie Shaw was a very high-level problem. For the past 6 months, the local Hells Angels had been systematically dismantling a cartel-backed methamphetamine operation that had tried to quietly set up shop in their desert territory. The Angels didn't take kindly to unauthorized businesses moving onto their turf, and they had responded with ruthless, violent efficiency. Several cartel shipments had vanished from the highways. 2 cartel lieutenants had been found out near Joshua Tree, stripped down and tied to cacti, severely beaten but alive, a very clear, agonizing message. The cartel was losing millions. They needed a message of their own. They needed to cut the head off the snake in the most public, humiliating way possible. A public assassination of the sergeant-at-arms would shatter the Angels' aura of invincibility and force a renegotiation of the territory. Damian took a seat at the far end of the bar, exactly 20 feet from the Angels' booth. He ordered a club soda with a lime wedge. Hank, busy counting out the register drawer, barely glanced at him. Sadie, however, was highly observant. You had to be when you grew up, dodging a volatile, unpredictable father. She watched the way people moved, how they shifted their weight, where their eyes darted. And she noticed immediately that Damien's eyes never actually looked at the television screen, playing a muted baseball game. He was watching the dusty mirror behind the bar, meticulously tracking the reflection of Artie Shaw's table. The bar was relatively quiet, the low hum of classic rock from the jukebox masking the hushed conversations. Sadie picked up her heavy tray, balancing the premium bourbon and 5 heavy Crystal Rocks glasses. "Take it over, and don't linger," Hank warned, wiping his hands on a dirty towel. "Artie looks like he's in a foul mood tonight, and Theo's already glaring at the pool tables." Sadie turned toward the service well. As she did, a burly trucker stumbled backward from his bar stool, colliding hard with a nearby Waitress station. A tray of empty pint glasses crashed to the floor, sending shards of thick glass exploding everywhere. "Damn it, Carl!" Hank yelled, rushing out from behind the bar to assess the damage and yell at the drunk patron. Every head in the room turned toward the chaotic noise, except Damien's. In the 3 seconds that Hank, Sadie, and the entire bar were distracted by the shattered glass, Damien moved. It was a fluid, highly practiced motion, so smooth it almost looked like a trick of the neon light. He slid off his stool, took 2 silent steps toward the unattended service well where Sadie's tray rested, and his hand hovered over the open neck of the bourbon bottle. Sadie had turned her head back just a fraction of a second too soon. She saw it. She saw the tiny, clear glass vial pinched perfectly between Damien's thumb and forefinger. She saw 2 thick, colorless drops fall directly into the amber liquid. She saw Damien seamlessly pivot on his heel, walk back to his stool, and pick up his club soda as if he hadn't moved an inch from his seat. Ice water flooded Sadie's veins. Her breath hitched, catching painfully in her throat. She knew exactly what she had just witnessed. Even if her brain was screaming at her in desperate denial, she had heard the whispered rumors about the desert turf war. This wasn't a prank. The cold, mechanical deadness in Damien's eyes wasn't the look of a man slipping a roofie to a college kid. It was the look of a professional executioner. Whatever was in that bottle was meant to stop a man's heart before he could finish his drink. Hank stormed back behind the bar, kicking a dustpan into the corner. "Sadie, what are you doing standing there like a statue? Get the angels their drink before Artie decides to use my head for a bowling ball." Sadie's hands began to shake. A violent, uncontrollable tremor started in her wrists and traveled rapidly up her arms. She stared at the bottle. If she delivered it, Artie Shaw was going to die. Right there in her section, choking on the floor. And when the Hells Angels figured out their sergeant-at-arms was poisoned at Hank's bar, they would burn the rusty spur to the ground and likely take out anyone who had served him. But if she spoke up, if she pointed a finger at the clean-cut man at the end of the bar, she was a 22-year-old girl making minimum wage. The man who dropped the poison was a cartel killer. The moment she opened her mouth, she was putting a massive target on her own back. The Sonora cartel didn't leave loose ends. They would find her. They would find her struggling mother. "Just walk away," a panicked voice in her head screamed. "Pretend you didn't see anything. Drop the tray. Say you feel violently ill, and run out the back door into the desert." "Sadie! Now!" Hank snapped, his patience entirely gone. Autopilot took over. Her trembling hands gripped the edges of the tray so hard, her knuckles turned white. The bourbon sloshed dangerously close to the rim of the bottle. She began the long walk across the scarred wooden floorboards. Every step felt like she was wading through wet cement. The fluorescent neon beer signs cast long, sinister shadows across the room, making the distance feel like a mile. She approached the corner booth. Artie was leaning back, his massive arms stretched across the red vinyl seats, laughing a deep, booming laugh at a story Bobby Callahan had just told about a busted transmission. The other 3 bikers were grinning, their rugged faces momentarily relaxed. "Evening, sweetheart," Artie rumbled as Sadie approached. His voice was surprisingly smooth, a deep baritone that naturally commanded the space. "Took you long enough. Hank, brewing the stuff in the back?" Sadie tried to smile, but her facial muscles were completely paralyzed. She lowered the tray to the edge of the table. The glasses clinked together loudly due to her violently shaking hands. "You okay, darling?" Theo Morrison asked. frowning slightly as he noticed her ghost-pale complexion and the sweat beading on her forehead. "You look like you're going to pass out." I'm fine," Sadie lied, her voice a thin, raspy whisper that barely carried over the jukebox. Artie reached forward, his massive, calloused hand wrapped around the neck of the tainted bourbon bottle. He began to pour, the poisoned amber liquid splashing neatly over the large ice cubes in the 5 glasses. The aroma of rich oak and sweet vanilla wafted up, perfectly masking whatever lethal chemistry now tainted it. Sadie stood frozen in place. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Damien watching from the bar, calmly sipping his club soda, waiting for the final curtain to fall. He was completely relaxed. In his mind, the job was already done. Artie picked up his glass. He raised it to the center of the table. The other 4 men picked up their drinks, bringing them together in a tight, brotherly circle. "To the open road, and the fools who try to block it," Artie toasted, a dark, knowing glint in his eye, referencing their recent cartel victories. "Here, here," the bikers grunted in unison. Artie brought the glass toward his face. He parted his lips. Sadie couldn't breathe. The exhausted face of her mother, the gruff kindness of Hank, and the horrifying image of a cartel hitman escaping into the night flashed through her mind. She wasn't a gangster. She wasn't a hero. But as she watched the rim of the glass tilt toward Artie's mouth, a sudden, inexplicable surge of defiant rage broke through her paralyzing terror. She wasn't going to let a murder happen on her shift. She lunged forward. Her hand shot out, her small, pale fingers wrapping tightly around Artie's thick, leather-clad wrist, just as the glass touched his silver beard. The entire booth froze. Touching a patched member, especially a high-ranking officer, without explicit permission, was a massive violation of MC protocol. Bobby Callahan's hand instantly dropped below the table, instinctively resting on the cold steel of a pistol grip tucked into his waistband. Artie didn't pull away. He just stopped, his cold eyes locking onto Sadie's. The easygoing, laughing demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by a terrifying, coiled intensity that sucked the air out of the room. "What the hell are you doing, girl?" Artie asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly whisper. Sadie was trembling so hard she thought her knees would finally give out. She leaned in close, the smell of aged leather and strong whiskey overpowering her senses, and looked the sergeant-at-arms dead in the eyes. "Don't drink that," she whispered, a single tear finally escaping and cutting a warm track down her cold cheek. Artie stared at her. He looked down at the glass in his hand, then back up at her terrified, desperate face. He didn't ask questions. He didn't yell. A man who survives decades in the outlaw motorcycle world develops a razor-sharp instinct for incoming danger, and he could smell the absolute, raw truth in Sadie's terror. Slowly, deliberately, Artie lowered the glass back to the table, never breaking eye contact with the young waitress. He didn't look around the room. He kept his voice steady and low. "Why?" Sadie swallowed hard. She slowly turned her head, her gaze shifting past the booth, past the empty pool tables, until her eyes locked directly onto Damien Russo, sitting alone at the far end of the bar. Damien realized in a fraction of a second that the quiet execution had failed. The relaxed posture vanished. His hand abandoned his club soda and began to slip inside the lapel of his tailored denim jacket. Before Sadie could even speak the words to explain, Artie's eyes followed her line of sight. He saw the stranger. He saw the hand moving for a weapon. "Bobby," Artie said, his voice completely flat and void of any emotion. "Yeah, boss," Bobby replied, his eyes already locked on the target. "Lock the doors." Before the final syllable of Artie's command had even left his mouth, the rusty spur transformed from a dusty dive bar into a fortified tomb. Bobby Callahan didn't just walk to the door. He moved with the terrifying, explosive speed of a man who had spent 3 decades surviving barroom brawls. He hit the heavy oak doors with his shoulder, flipping the iron deadbolts with a deafening clack-clack that echoed over the sudden silence of the room. At the exact same moment, Hank reached under the bar and violently yanked the master power cord to the jukebox. The classic rock died instantly, leaving only the buzzing hum of the neon beer signs. Damien Russo was fast, but he was a surgeon in a room full of butchers. His hand cleared his denim jacket, drawing a suppressed Heckler and Koch USP compact. He aimed directly at Artie's chest, but he never got to pull the trigger. Theo Morrison had already moved. With a fluid, practiced motion, Theo swept a heavy glass ashtray off the neighboring table and hurled it like a fastball. It struck Damien square in the wrist with a sickening crack. The suppressed pistol clattered onto the hardwood floor, spinning harmlessly toward the pool tables. Before Damien could even cry out in pain, two other patched members were on him. They didn't punch him. They dismantled him. One kicked his legs out from under him, sending his chin crashing into the edge of the mahogany bar, while the other planted a heavy, steel-toed motorcycle boot firmly on the back of his neck, pinning him to the floorboards. "Don't move, suit," Theo growled, racking the slide of a sawed-off Remington 870 shotgun he had produced from beneath his leather cut. The metallic shuck-shuck sound was the universal language for absolute compliance. Damien didn't struggle. He was a professional. He knew the mathematics of violence better than anyone, and he knew that breathing, even painfully, was a privilege he currently held by a very thin thread. Artie Shaw hadn't even stood up. He remained seated in the corner booth, his massive hands resting calmly on the red vinyl table. He looked at Sadie, who was still standing there, her hand hovering in the air where she had just grabbed his wrist. She was hyperventilating, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. She had just initiated a gangland standoff. "Breathe, sweetheart," Artie said, his deep voice surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the brutal violence that had just unfolded 10 feet away. "You're safe. Nobody in this room is going to lay a finger on you. You have my absolute word on that." He slowly stood up, towering over the terrified waitress. Artie was a veteran of the club, a man who had ridden with the old guard, men who remembered the days of Sonny Barger and the brutal highway wars of the 70s. He respected loyalty, and he respected guts. This 22-year-old girl, trembling like a leaf, had just risked her own life to save his. "Tell me exactly what you saw," Artie instructed, his eyes locking onto hers. Sadie swallowed hard, forcing the words past the dry lump in her throat. When Carl knocked over the glasses, when you all looked away." He walked over to the service station. He had a tiny glass vial. He put 2 drops of clear liquid into the reserve bourbon. Artie looked down at the 5 glasses of premium whiskey sitting innocently on the table. He picked up his glass, swirling the amber liquid, holding it up to the dim neon light. It looked perfect. It smelled perfect. "Bring him over here," Artie commanded, without turning around. The 2 bikers hoisted Damien off the floor by his armpits, dragging him across the room like a rag doll. They shoved him roughly into the booth opposite Artie. Damien's lip was split, bleeding down the front of his expensive shirt, and he favored his shattered right wrist, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. He wasn't panicking. He was analyzing. "Search him," Artie ordered. Bobby went through Damien's pockets. He tossed a thick leather wallet, a burner cell phone, and a small, empty glass vial onto the table. Artie picked up the vial. He sniffed it cautiously. Nothing. Odorless. "You Sonora boys are getting desperate," Artie rumbled, leaning forward so his face was mere inches from Damien's. "Sending a hitman into my local spot? Trying to poison my drink like some medieval coward? You must be bleeding cash worse than we thought if you're pulling this kind of sloppy desperation play." Damien spit a mouthful of blood onto the floor. It wasn't desperate. It was surgical. If the waitress hadn't possessed superhero vision, you'd be having a massive, untraceable heart attack right now, and I would have walked out the front door before you even hit the floor. "But you didn't," Theo interjected, pressing the cold muzzle of the shotgun against the back of Damien's skull. "Now you're in the devil's waiting room, pal. Let's talk business," Damien said, his voice remarkably steady. "You know how the cartel operates. If I disappear tonight, they don't just send another guy. They send 20. They burn this bar down with the old man and the girl inside. They go to your clubhouses. But I have access to a Cayman account. $2 million. Untraceable crypto. Let me walk out that back door. You keep the money. And I tell my bosses that the territory is too fortified. We all win." Artie let out a low, rumbling laugh that vibrated in his chest. You think you can buy your way out of poisoning an officer of the Hells Angels? You think this is a negotiation? Damien's confident facade cracked, just a fraction. He looked at the faces of the bikers surrounding him. There was no greed in their eyes. There was only the cold, unyielding promise of violence. The tension in the rusty spur was thick enough to choke on. Hank stood perfectly still behind the bar, a baseball bat gripped tightly in his hands, watching history unfold in his establishment. Sadie had backed away, pressing herself against the wood-paneled wall, praying she would wake up from this nightmare. "Here's the problem with your math suit," Artie said, picking up the glass of poisoned bourbon and placing it directly in front of Damien. "You work for a corporation. You answer to accountants and cartel bosses in high-rises who care about profit margins. We don't. We're a brotherhood. You threaten our lives. You threaten our families. There is no price tag that buys you forgiveness." Artie tapped the thick crystal glass. "Now, I'm a fair man. You brought a drink to my table. I insist you have one with us." Damien stared at the amber liquid. The color drained completely from his face. For the first time all night, genuine, primal fear leaked into his dead eyes. "No," Damien whispered. "That's a synthesized aconitine derivative. It paralyzes the heart muscles in less than 3 minutes. There is no antidote." "Fascinating," Artie said casually. "Drink it." "If I die, my handler drops the hammer," Damien shouted, losing his composure. "I have a check-in call at midnight. If I miss it, they send the squad. They know exactly where I am." Artie checked his heavy steel wristwatch. It was 11:45 p.m. "Then let's call him now," Artie suggested. He picked up Damien's burner phone and slid it across the table. "Unlock it. Put him on speaker, or Bobby takes off your kneecaps with a claw hammer. Your choice." Damien's shaking, unbroken left hand reached out. He punched in a passcode. He dialed a single number and hit the speaker button. The phone rang twice. "Damien," a smooth, heavily accented voice answered. "Is it done?" Damien looked at Artie. Artie nodded, tapping his finger against his own temple, urging him to speak. "Victor," Damien stammered. There was a complication. They knew I was coming." There was a long, chilling pause on the other end of the line. When Victor spoke again, his tone had changed completely. It wasn't the voice of a concerned handler. It was the voice of a man wrapping up loose ends. "I know, Damien. I'm the one who tipped them off." The silence in the bar was absolute. Damien stared at the phone in total shock. "What?" Damien breathed out. "You charge too much, Damien," Victor said smoothly over the speakerphone. "And the bosses wanted a war anyway to justify moving heavy hitters across the border. We needed a martyr, an expensive American hitman dying at the hands of the Hells Angels. That is the perfect excuse for us to wipe them off the map entirely. You were never meant to walk out of that bar alive, my friend. Vaya con Dios." The line clicked dead. Damien sat frozen, the ultimate betrayal washing over him. He was a ghost, a professional, and he had been played like a cheap pawn. The cartel hadn't just sent him to kill Artie. They had sent him to die. Artie leaned back, a grim smirk playing on his lips. "Well, ain't that a twist? Your corporate buddies threw you to the wolves." Damien looked up at the sergeant-at-arms. The fight was completely gone from him. He was a dead man, either at the hands of the Angels or the cartel. He looked down at the poisoned bourbon. "They're coming," Damien said numbly. Victor wasn't lying. "They're going to use my death to scorch this earth." "Let them come," Artie said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of a general preparing for war. "We've been riding this desert since before Victor was born. This is our sand. We don't bleed out in it. We bury people in it." Artie pushed the glass an inch closer. "You're a dead man, Damien. The only choice you have left is how much it hurts. You can take the drink, close your eyes, and go to sleep. Or Bobby can take you out to the shed out back, and we can spend the next 6 hours finding out exactly how loud a ghost can scream." Damien looked at the massive, scarred bikers surrounding him. He looked at the cold, hard steel of the shotgun. He knew the reputation of the club. He knew what happened in the sheds. With a trembling left hand, Damien reached out. He wrapped his fingers around the crystal glass. He didn't offer a toast. He didn't say a prayer. He brought the glass to his lips and threw the amber liquid back in one smooth motion, swallowing the lethal bourbon down to the last drop. He set the empty glass down with a soft clink. He leaned his head back against the red vinyl booth, closed his eyes, and simply waited for his heart to stop. Artie watched him for exactly 1 minute as Damien's breathing grew incredibly shallow, his chest hitching as the chemical rapidly invaded his nervous system. Within 2 minutes, Damien's head slumped forward. By the third minute, the hitman was entirely still. "Bobby, Theo," Artie commanded quietly, "wrap him in a tarp. Put him in the trunk of his own rental car. Park it outside Victor's suspected safe house in Barstow. Leave a club calling card on his chest. Let the cartel know we accept their invitation to war." The bikers moved efficiently, hoisting the lifeless body and carrying it toward the back exit. Artie remained at the booth. He stood up and slowly walked over to where Sadie was, still pressed against the wall, trembling. The young waitress was convinced she was next, a loose end that needed tying. Instead, Artie reached into the inner pocket of his leather cut. He pulled out a massive, rubber-banded stack of $100 bills, club money, easily $10,000. He pressed the brick of cash firmly into Sadie's shaking hands. "You saved my life tonight, Sadie," Artie said, his eyes locking onto hers with intense sincerity. "That means your debts are paid. Your father's medical bills are paid. And from this night forward, until the day you die, you are under the protection of the Hells Angels. If anyone, cartel, cops, or some drunk trucker ever looks at you sideways, you tell Hank to make a phone call." He stepped back, tipping his head slightly in respect. "Now, take a week off. It's going to get a little loud around here." As Artie turned and walked out the front doors into the Mojave night, leaving the neon-soaked silence of the rusty spur behind, Sadie realized two things. She would never escape the memory of this night. But for the first time in her life, she didn't have to be afraid of the dark anymore. Did Sadie make the right call stepping into gang warfare? Drop a comment below with what you would have done in her shoes. If this real-life desert showdown kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button, share it with a friend, and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories of outlaw justice.